from thousands of Russian soldiers dug into fortified position to a collapsing front line to a single Ukrainian operation that just changed the entire calculus of this war. What happened in the last 72 hours was not supposed to be possible. Russian commanders had spent months reinforcing this position. They poured in equipment, manpower, logistics corridors. Every Western analyst called it one of the most defensible strongholds on the entire Eastern Front. And yet, by the time the smoke settled, Ukrainian forces had not just cracked it, they had broken through it entirely. Stay with me, because what looks like a single battlefield victory on the surface is something far more consequential underneath. This is not just a story about territory changing hands. This is a story about what happens when a military that has spent 3 years learning, adapting, and innovating finally decides it has learned enough and goes all in. To understand why this moment matters so much, we need to go back, not days, not weeks, months. Because this offensive did not begin with tanks and drones crossing a line on a map. It began with a decision made at the highest levels of Ukrainian military command, a decision that most people outside Kiev did not fully appreciate until now. For most of this war, Ukraine has fought a fundamentally reactive conflict. Russian forces would push, Ukrainian forces would absorb, fortify, and hold. It was brutal, grinding, and deeply costly, but it was survivable. And while Ukraine was surviving, something else was happening quietly in the background. Ukrainian commanders were watching, cataloging Russian patterns, identifying the specific pressure points in Russia's entire defensive architecture along the eastern axis. They were not waiting for the war to end. They were waiting for the right moment to fundamentally change its direction. That moment arrived. And the stronghold Russia just lost was not simply a city or a tree line. It was the geographic anchor of Russia's entire supply corridor in that sector. Lose it, and 3 separate Russian groupings become operationally isolated from one another. Lose it, and the logistics math for 60,000 Russian troops in that region becomes unsustainable within weeks. The Russian command understood this, which is exactly why they reinforced it so heavily, which is exactly why losing it is so catastrophic. Now, before we get to the mechanics of how Ukraine actually pulled this off, because the method is where this story gets genuinely extraordinary, we need to understand the system Ukraine just destroyed. Stay with me. Russia's defensive doctrine along the Eastern Front has been described by Ukrainian intelligence officers, Western military analysts, and even dissident Russian military bloggers using the same word: rigid. The Russian military, for all of its mass, for all of its artillery weight, operates on a system of centralized command that cannot flex in real time. When a sector comes under unexpected pressure, the response travels up the chain, gets assessed, gets approved, and then travels back down. In a fast-moving battle, that process takes hours, sometimes longer. And in those hours, entire defensive lines can unravel. Ukrainian planners studied this. They studied it in the Kharkiv counteroffensive of 2022. They studied it again in the Kherson operation. They understood that Russia's greatest vulnerability was not its firepower. It had plenty of that, but its decision-making speed. A fast enough Ukrainian operation striking in multiple places simultaneously would exceed Russia's ability to respond coherently. The question was whether Ukraine could generate that speed across a wide enough front to truly exploit the gap. For a long time, the answer was no. Ukraine lacked the offensive mass, but that calculus has been changing. And in this operation, it changed decisively. Here is where the intelligence picture becomes critical. Weeks before the first Ukrainian vehicle crossed the line of contact in this sector, Ukrainian military intelligence, the HUR, had already built a near-complete picture of Russian defensive positions, not from satellite imagery alone, from a combination of drone reconnaissance, signals intercept, informant networks inside occupied territory, and an increasingly sophisticated analysis of Russian logistical movement patterns. They knew where the reserves were staged. They knew which roads would be cut first to prevent reinforcement. They knew the approximate response timeline for each Russian battalion in the region. And then they did something that most analysts did not see coming. They did not attack where Russia expected them to attack. They created a feint, a serious, well-resourced feint, along a secondary axis that forced Russian command to commit reserves in the wrong direction. Russian commanders, conditioned by months of attritional pressure along that secondary line, made the rational decision given the information they had. They moved forces to stabilize a sector that appeared to be collapsing. And in doing so, they stripped the one place that could not afford to be stripped. That is when Ukraine moved. And the three-layer operational system they used to break the stronghold is something every serious student of modern warfare needs to understand. The first layer was electronic. Ukrainian EW units had spent weeks mapping and then degrading Russian communications infrastructure in the target sector, not destroying it, degrading it. Enough interference that Russian units in the breakthrough zone would experience critical delays in reporting and receiving orders precisely when speed was most essential. When Ukrainian armor began moving, Russian unit commanders in the path of the assault were operating with fragmented, delayed situational awareness. They were making decisions based on a picture of the battlefield that was already 20-30 minutes out of date. The second layer was aerial. Ukraine has quietly assembled one of the most effective drone warfare packages on any battlefield in the world right now, not through sheer numbers alone, though the numbers are significant, but through integration. FPV, kamikaze drones, long-range strike drones, and reconnaissance UAVs operated as a single coordinated system over the breakthrough corridor. Every Russian vehicle that moved to respond to the Ukrainian ground advance was tracked within minutes. Most were engaged within 30. Russian armored reinforcements that would normally have reached the contested zone within an hour and a half were destroyed on the road before they arrived. The Stronghold, which on paper had significant armored reserves nearby, was effectively isolated in real time by a drone corridor that nothing motorized could cross without being targeted. The third layer, and this is the element that most coverage has not fully examined, was deception at the operational level. Ukrainian forces that broke through did not drive directly toward the stronghold's center. They drove toward its flanks and its rear simultaneously. They were not trying to fight their way in through the fortified front. They were trying to make staying inside the fortification militarily irrational, and it worked. Russian garrison commanders, seeing Ukrainian forces appearing behind their position and simultaneously losing communications coherence, faced a choice between a fighting withdrawal and encirclement. Some fought, many withdrew, and the ones who withdrew created a collapse that cascaded faster than any individual commander could have predicted or stopped. I want every viewer to understand the full significance of what that means tactically. A fortified position that takes months to build and requires constant resupply can be hollowed out in hours if the force holding it loses confidence that it can be reinforced or extracted. Russia's men in that stronghold did not simply lose a battle. They lost the belief that their own command could reach them in time. And once that belief goes, no amount of concrete or artillery changes the outcome. Now look at the immediate numbers. Ukrainian military officials have confirmed territorial gains that, measured in square kilometers, may sound modest to a casual observer. They are not modest. The terrain captured in this operation includes high ground that provides direct observation over Russian logistics routes extending 30 kilometers to the east. Ukrainian artillery position there can now interdict supply convoys that previously moved freely. 3 Russian battalion tactical groups that were drawing ammunition and food through this corridor now have no viable ground route that is not under observed fire. The Russian military has 2 options: a costly and dangerous aerial resupply of those units, which Ukrainian air defenses will contest aggressively, or a withdrawal to a new defensive line that concedes even more ground and demonstrates to everyone watching, including Russia's own soldiers, that the front is not stable. There's another dimension here that Russian state media has not and will not discuss openly. This operation happened fast enough that the standard Russian information control mechanism, suppress, delay, reframe, could not keep pace. Russian military bloggers on Telegram, the same nationalist voices that Moscow tolerates because they maintain a veneer of informed patriotic commentary, began reporting the breakthrough before the defense ministry had issued any statement at all. Some of those bloggers are now describing what happened in language that, even filtered through their own pro-Russian framework, reads as a serious defeat. That matters, Because inside Russia, the Telegram military blogging ecosystem reaches millions of people who have long since stopped trusting official television. When even those voices cannot spin a situation positively, the information environment inside Russia absorbs a shock that official channels cannot simply paper over. The demographic and manpower implications extend the problem further. Russia has been absorbing enormous casualties in this war for over 3 years. The men being lost in operations like this one are increasingly not the expendable first wave contract soldiers of 2022. They are trained, experienced fighters, men who learned how to survive in this war and who cannot be replaced quickly by the wave of mobilized recruits currently moving through truncated training programs. Ukraine's military, by contrast, has spent 3 years building institutional knowledge about how to fight this enemy. Every brigade that participated in this operation has veterans who remember what did not work before and adapted. That asymmetry in institutional learning is widening, not narrowing. NATO member states have been watching this operation with a level of analytical attention that goes well beyond routine monitoring. What Ukraine just demonstrated, the integration of electronic warfare, drone interdiction corridors, multi-axis ground assault, and real-time operational deception, is a battlefield methodology that Western militaries have theorized about for a decade, but have never seen executed at this scale against a near-peer opponent in live conditions. The briefings happening right now in Warsaw, in London, and Washington are not merely tracking the war. They are studying a proof of concept for how future large-scale conventional conflict will actually unfold. Ukraine has become, involuntarily and at enormous human cost, the world's most advanced laboratory for modern warfare. And what just happened in this operation is one of its most significant findings. For Russia, the path forward from here is narrowing in ways that strategic planners in Moscow are absolutely aware of, even if public-facing rhetoric refuses to acknowledge it. The doctrine of overwhelming mass, the idea that Russia can simply generate enough men and enough shells to exhaust Ukrainian resistance, has run into a brutal arithmetic problem. Ukraine's ability to destroy that mass faster than it can be committed is improving. The stronghold that just fell was supposed to demonstrate Russian resilience. Instead, it has demonstrated the opposite. And every Russian general looking at that outcome is now calculating how many more positions along the front are vulnerable to the same methodology. Ukraine is not celebrating. That much is clear from the tone of Ukrainian military communications, which are measured, forward-looking, and deliberately restrained. There is an understanding in Kyiv that a single operation, however successful, does not end a war. What it does is open a window of Russian defensive disorganization, of fractured morale, of logistical exposure that must be exploited before Russian command can stabilize, reinforce, and adapt. Whether Ukraine has the resources, the international support, and the strategic resolve to keep the pressure on through that window is the question that will define the next phase of this war. What comes next will tell us a very great deal about whether this moment is a turning point or a peak. Watch where Ukrainian forces press in the coming weeks. Watch whether Western ammunition deliveries accelerate to match the operational tempo Ukraine is now attempting to sustain. And watch the Russian telegram sphere, because when the men closest to the front, even the ones committed to Russian victory, begin describing events in terms of crisis rather than temporary setback, you are seeing something real break through the noise. This war is not over, but something fundamental shifted in the last 72 hours. Stay with this channel because we are going to track every development as it happens with the analysis, the context, and the honesty that this conflict demands.